Hello, everyone. My name is Taeksu Kim, and welcome to the Korean Cultural Society of Boston's New Music Symposium, sponsored by the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in Boston. I am very excited to have Dr. Hyo-shin Na as today's guest. And please let me explain a little bit about our guest today. So Dr. Hyo-shin Na has been commissioned by the Fromm Foundation at Harvard University, the Koussevitzky Foundation, the Zellerbach Family Foundation, the Argosy Foundation, the W F Hewlett Foundation, the Elaine and Richard Fohr Foundation, InterMusic San Francisco, the Other Minds Festival, and the Los Angeles International New Music Festival, among many others. Her music has been performed internationally by the Barton Workshop, the San Francisco Contemporary Music Players, the Kronos Quartet, the San Jose Chamber Orchestra, the National Gugak Center Orchestra of Korea, the Del Sol String Quartet, the Ives Quartet, the Airplay Ensemble, New Music Works, the Pacific Chamber Orchestra, the Korean Traditional Orchestra of the National Theater of Korea. And her portrait concerts, filled with only her music, were presented by New Music Works in the US, the Barton Workshop in Europe, and the Jongga Akhwe Ensemble in South Korea. And she has been awarded twice of the Korean National Composers Prize in two different categories, one for music written for a Western instrument, and the other for music written for Korean traditional instruments. Her music has been recorded on the Funtech, Top Art, Soul, and New World Record labels. And her music, since 2006, has been exclusively published by Lantro Music in Belgium. And interestingly, she is an author of a bilingual book called Conversations with Gayagum Master Byung-gi Hwang. We talked about this last week briefly. And she received her bachelor's degree from Ewha Women's University in South Korea. Then she moved to the States and she received her master's degree from Manhattan School of Music and doctoral degree from the University of Colorado Boulder. If you want to know more about her and her music, you are welcome to visit her website, www.hyo-shin-na.com. Today, we are going to hear about her and her music, and please feel free to ask some questions on the chat room or chat window or on Facebook comments section so that we can deliver after she finishes her talk about her music. And after today's lecture, we will have we will send a survey to our Zoom participants today. We have lots of them here today. I'm very happy to see it. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Hyo-shin Na. And we will begin the lecture by listening to another piece by her.
This was the recent premiere performance of my weaving variations after Victor Jara's Angelita Huenuman that I wrote last year for 2 violins. Since there was no live audience for this February 26th concert because of COVID restrictions and it was live streamed, you see the musicians wearing masks on stage. Victor Jara, born in 1932 and died in 1973, was a Chilean musician. I first heard his song Angelita Huenuman back in the 1980s. Angelita Huenuman was a weaver who lived with a young son and 5 dogs on a little farm. I was struck particularly by the beauty of this part of the text. By the light of a window, Angelita weaves her life. Her hands dance among the threads like the little wings of the chinkle. Chinkle is a sparrow-like a small bird that lives in South America. It's a miracle how she weaves a flower, giving it its aroma too. On your looms, Angelita, are time, tears, and sweat. There are the forgotten hands of this, my creative people. I composed a piece entitled Hagum Weaving for Hagum and Piano in 2010, taking the title and some pitchy materials from this song by Victor Hara. In 2019, I wrote Hagum Weaving 2 for Hagum Solo. And finally, in 2020, I wrote Hagum Variations for 2 violins. I enjoy the challenges of writing for both Korean and non-Korean instruments. And after I wrote the 2 pieces for Hagum Piano Duo and Hagum Solo, I was tempted to challenge myself to write another piece for violin. In this case, 2 violins to double the challenge. Hagum, as you probably know, has 2 strings. On Hagum, the strings and bow hairs are very loose, while those on the violin are much tighter. I prefer to treat each instrument according to its nature. So, for instance, the speed of the bow, the behavior of vibrato and grace note, and timbre on each instrument should feel as natural and comfortable as possible. A bit like speaking one's own first language instead of speaking a foreign language with an accent. You don't want the Hagum player to play Hagum in the manner of playing violin and vice versa. Could we look at the variations score page now? I'd like to talk a bit about a piece I wrote a long time ago, 1990, Variations for Piano Solo. In the spring of 1988, I had completed all the work for my doctorate. Now it was time to move away from the advice and way of thinking of my teachers, so I was on my own. However, instead of feeling liberated and happy, I felt lost. I found myself rejecting everything I wrote that reminded me of something my teachers would like. As a result, I couldn't write anything. It took me 2 years to write Variations, and it's only 12 minutes long. I knew, of course, that a set of variations must have a theme, so I avoided writing a theme. Instead, I wrote 2 notes on interval. A theme was supposed to be developed in a set of clearly delineated variations. I decided against development and wrote continuous variations on the interval in 5 big sections. The texture of my piece was transparent, lacking the expected accumulation of notes that would form harmonies. Since I'd heard the almost constant ornamenting of notes in Korean music, I wrote a lot of grace notes that made the piece should sound less fixed and square. I tried to make the piano sound like a melody instrument, not a harmony instrument, and because at times I wrote faster music in the highest and lowest registers, omitting the middle, the piano sounded a bit like a marimba. Well, we'll listen to variations played by Thomas Schultz. To save time, maybe we can listen to the first 6 minutes or so of it. piece has been played by many pianists, including some young musicians who have played recently. They all seem to think some parts of the piece are rather challenging. I have to admit that as a young composer, I was so focused on searching for my own way of composing that I wasn't really thinking about how practical it would be for the pianist. Many young Korean composers have told me that my music, because it is so Korean, has made them realize the importance of knowing our Korean music. I try to tell them that it's best to learn as much of it as possible, but then they must then move away from it. When I began to learn to play traditional instruments, I was changed by the music and by the playing. The music itself was my teacher. Every couple of years, I will hear from a graduate student in Korea or the US who wants to write a dissertation or thesis on my music, usually wanting to write about what is Korean in my music. I'll often ask them to do some preliminary studies to get to know some of the basics of traditional Korean music. I find it interesting that when they get back in touch with me after some time, they now see all of the things in my pieces that are not Korean. Let's take a look at a page of Rain Study. Actually, this is a half of the second page of Rain Study. This piece is published on a large sized paper, and my scanner at home is rather small, so I was able to get only left side, so you get the half of the page. This piece, Rain Study from 1999, is the second in the series of studies for solo piano that began with Piano Study 1 in 1997. These are studies for both pianist and composer. The focus of both pieces is on the layering of melodies and the superimposition of the pianist's hand. As you can see, the first half of Rain Study is written using spatial notation. Even in an early piano piece like Variations, the piece we just heard, I wrote a lot of grace notes. In the central slower section of the piece, almost every main note has a grace note preceding it. I feel that the sheer number of grace notes both complicates and lightens the rhythmic flow of the music. In Rain Study, 9 years after Variations again, lots of grace notes. Now both before and after the main notes with a similar effect as in the earlier piece, but here both grace notes and spatial notation at the same time makes the music much more complex and unpredictable. It's a sort of shift away from the ornamental grace note in composers like Bach, Mozart, and Schubert to the grace note as a truly integral element. When I was writing Rain Study, we had a solarium at the back of the house with glass walls and roof, and even though there was no heat, I used to sit there during winter rainstorms and listen to the rain sweeping over the room, amplified by the glass. Much of the material for Rain Study has its origin in Sanyeonbul, a Korean folk song. The words to Sanyeonbul state, "The sun that sets will rise again tomorrow. A life that passes will never return." We'll listen to only a small part of Rain Study because of the time limit we have today. This is a playing of Kevin Lee's son, who has played Variations along with a few more pieces of mine. Again, let's hear the first 6 minutes or so. now we'll take a look at a page of another piece called Akhmatova's Muse.
Actually, before it, can we ask a question? Yeah, I have two questions. One from the Facebook and one from my own. On the Facebook, we have a question about your variations. So, what is the interval you wrote?
B to F sharp.
So, perfect fourth, perfect fifth.
Perfect
Should I
fourth.
say?
Inversion would be perfect fifth. The fifth
Uh-huh.
would be 2 and 3, so it becomes everything.
Oh wow. Okay. So, I mean, is there a specific reason you chose that notes then?
Well, why those two notes? I don't remember. I began to that piece in 1988 and finished it in 1990. My memory is not that good.
Okay. About the range study, am I correct that the performer like played it by memory? There
Yeah,
was no score on the piano.
yes. He actually played
Wow.
variations from memory. Well, young people do that. Quite unusual
Wow.
range study, yes.
No, that's really impressive. So now let's have a look at of the page of
Okay.
Akhmatova's Muse.
Mhm. Well, the top of the page, it shows the tuning of the 25 string kayagum. And the bottom of the page has a part of the page 4, I think fourth page. And this is to show how the musicians were coordinating with each other. So these are two different separate things that I wanted to show you. Akhmatova's Muse 2001 is for both Western and Korean instruments: flute, alto flute, daegum, oboe, piri, and 25-string hayagum. The piece was written after I read Anna Akhmatova's poem, The Muse. When at night I await her coming, it seems that life hangs by a strand. What are honors? What is youth? What is freedom compared to that dear guest with rustic pipe in hand? And she enters. Drawing aside her shawl, she gazes attentively at me. I say to her, "Was it you who dictated to Dante the pages of the Inferno?" She replies, "It was I." The musicians coordinate with each other in a flexible manner, deciding the length of notes and the dynamics by listening to the other players instead of busily counting beats and measures. When I wrote this piece, I wasn't thinking in terms of Western or Eastern instruments. It was simply like writing another string quartet or woodwind quintet. Each instrument was treated just as it is. I didn't try to blend the sound of piri with that of oboe, or trying to balance the sound of a kayagum with a group of wind instruments. No player is forced to change the character of their instrument to make it louder or softer, brighter or duller, in order for all of the sounds to mix. I'd rather not compromise the integrity of differing sounds and ideas. I prefer to let them interact, coexist, and conflict in the music. I used a 25-string kayagum for the first time in this piece. Of course, this is one of the modernized or modified instruments of Korea, designed primarily to make possible the playing of very rapid or loud passages and to make music that uses Western harmonies. However, I attempted to write music for the instrument without losing its original kayagum nature, and in fact, tried to turn these new aspects of the instrument to the music's advantage. For example, I had the idea to tune the instrument in a special way by giving the same pitch to alternate strings in a sort of zigzag tuning. Actually, this sort of tuning has been used on the Japanese six-string zither wagon. I also asked that another 5 adjacent strings be tuned to the same pitch and played in rapid succession. The result was a sort of halo-like blur. In a later piece, I also experimented with a way of producing vibrato on the group of strings tuned in this way with the palm of the left hand instead of usual vibrato produced with the fingers. In my most recent piece for the traditional 12-string kayagum, I asked the player throughout the piece to pluck strings on the left side of the bridge as well as the usual way of playing on the right side. These are just ways of making a subtly different sound on the instrument. In Akhmatova's Muse, the Dagon player plays multiphonics, and the PD player at times uses only the mouthpiece of the instrument. Again, this was simply a way to produce a different timbre on the instrument. I wasn't trying to use extended techniques or to use the instrument as an avant-garde sound source. We'll listen to a part of this piece maybe from the very beginning, about 4 minutes or so. now we will take a look at the first page of a piece called Song of the Firewood, which is a solo piece for 25-string kayagum. I wanted to show on the top of the page the tuning of this piece, about the tuning that I used that 1/3 of a whole step and also 2/3 of a whole step. And I actually, at first, I considered using a quarter tone, but then I thought I might end up getting like half steps, which I didn't want. So it has some different tuning. As you might have noticed, I'm often inspired by literature, poetry, stories, sometimes just a sentence or two from an essay by a writer I admire. A good example is a poem written decades ago by Jaime de Angulo. Here's his poem, Song of the Firewood. I am old, twisted, dry. I am cold. Build a fire. Hey, feel good. Let the chief call the dancers. I like the compact, almost anti-poetic feel of the poem. I like the way the direction of the poem changes quickly and the humorous, even ridiculous undertone. Whether the music I write necessarily reflect all of these qualities or any of them is not my primary focus. The poem is instead a strong stimulus to my musical imagination. When I read a poem, suddenly I hear the music. So literature, also visual art, paintings, sculpture, drawings, and of course, nature. Even the way a baked potato looks on my plate. De Angulo, who was born in 1887 in Paris, studied medicine at Johns Hopkins University and subsequently lived mostly in California, Carmel, Berkeley, and San Francisco as a linguist, poet, and musicologist. The texture and structure of the music resembles the process of firewood becoming ashes. Again, maybe we can listen to the first 6 minutes or so of this piece, Song of the Firewood. The name of the player is Hyun-chae Kim, who also actually played from memory. I wrote Ocean Shore in 2002 for chamber orchestra and PD solo, and in 2003, Ocean Shore 2 for clarinet, violin, viola, and cello. These two pieces are a study of the use of diverse materials and on the coexistence within a piece of music of various instruments. As in the meeting and interaction of water and land, these instruments can have fundamentally very different characters, PD and violin, or clarinet and cello, yet shouldn't lose their basic nature in the interest of harmony or even beauty. I wrote Ocean Shore 2 for the San Francisco New Music Group Year Play to celebrate the 100th year of Korean American immigration. We'll listen to a part of this piece, not from the very beginning, but from the middle of it. And this recording was made by the Barton Workshop in Amsterdam.
Two men were seated near me in a bus, well dressed, well fed, in the 40s. Obviously respected members of their community, talking together calmly, the way men of good breeding and education talk. And the speech may have been either Greek or Italian. I could not hear enough of it to decide. Suddenly, a woman seated directly behind them began in a loud voice, "Why don't you talk American? You live here, don't you? You make your living here. Talk American." One of the men turned to glance at her, and then the two went on talking in Greek or Italian. Calmly, quietly. Although every now and then the woman cried out, "Talk American, why don't you?" If these men were Jews, I thought, how uneasy they would have become, and their faces would show it. One of them might even say to the woman, if he knew enough English, "This is a free country, isn't it?" And there would be a noisy argument, or they might become silent. The two men, however, continued to talk as they had been doing, and neither turned to glance at the woman, or show by gesture or grimace that they heard her. Finally, she jumped up and sat down beside me. "What do you think of these men?" she asked. "Why don't they talk American? They live here, don't they? They make their money here." You must not be so impatient, I said. English is not an easy language to learn. Besides, if they don't learn it, their children will. We have good schools, you know. She looked at me suspiciously and, when the bus stopped, hurried off, fleeing our contamination. One of the men turned to me and said, quietly, in the best of American, with not a trace of a foreign accent, "She's a little cracked, isn't she?"
The text spoken by the cellist is a poem by the American poet Charles Reznikov. It was a part of a very long poem called By the Well of Living and Seeing. I have one more piece to introduce to you today. I wrote Song of the Bear in 2015 after reading Joanne Kiger's poem Destruction, which describes a bear breaking into a quiet cabin in the mountains when nobody is home, eating fruit, granola, coffee, and the LSD and peyote stash, whatever those might be, spilling spices and ink, ripping open the waterbed, things like that. As the poem ends, the bear finds a good cave in which to sleep it all off. While I was amused and entertained by the bear's activities in Kiger's poem, I was much more intrigued by the curiosity and straightforwardness of the bear's mind. And this was my focus in writing the music. Maybe we can listen to the first 5 minutes or so. Taxi, do we have enough time? Are we doing okay?
Yes, we do have enough time.
for Gyeongso Park on the Kayagum with sonnet string ensemble.
That is wonderful. And I have so many questions to ask, but I would love to invite others first to ask question if they have any. But first of all, thank you very much for a fascinating talk and sharing your wonderful music.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, there's one comment about your piece, the firewood. I clearly hear the firewood burning. So that's great. And so before we move forward, so what's really, really impressive to me is how prolific you are and how consistently prolific you have been after the 2 years you had, 2 years of writer's block, or I mean the transition, I would say. And you mentioned that you get often inspired by the literature. So I think I know your source, but how do you discipline yourself to be so prolific? How many hours you write? Do you compose every day? I mean, can you tell us about a little bit of that?
Well, I think players, the instrumentalists practice all the time. I mean, they practice every day. No one asks them, so it's a little amusing to me. But for me, I try to write every day if possible. And motivation, I don't know. I work for some hours, sometimes many hours, and sometimes less hours. I stop when I feel I've done enough. Then, in between during the night, I still think about it. So I can't wait to get back to it next morning. So just, and those 2 years, I didn't have a writer's block. I was just rejecting a lot. So I wrote very slowly.
I see. That's great. Do you have any advice for other composers who lack of motivation, just like me sometimes?
I mean, who am I to say anything? I feel that as a creative artist, each one of us is tending one's own garden. At least I feel that way. So I hope just a lot of good music being written, and I hope people enjoy it. I mean,
That's wonderful. And so what are your next projects? That
I'm
should be the last question, but I just wanted to add it right now while we talk about this.
I'm working on an orchestra piece right now, and after that, a piece for a quartet and a piece for quintet, just little pieces to write.
Mhm. A little piece for an orchestra. That doesn't make sense to me, but
Only 12 minutes.
sure. And I enjoyed looking at your scores, beautifully written. And I noticed that none of the pieces you shared with us today have time signature. Is it like a common in your pieces, or it just happened that all these pieces did not have time signature?
I do use time signature.
Okay.
Well,
Um,
practical reason. Sometimes it's easier to coordinate or to play. Depends on.
okay. And it was also interesting comments that to me, you seem to incorporate lots of extended technique. I mean, that's a hot potato topic, but you mentioned that you just use it for your own expression's sake,
Well,
right?
a lot of people, the young composers and comp students say, "Oh, I studied your score and I read a book about this instrument written by so and so, and it has so many examples of your music, and I learned a lot." I feel that's like a backwards that I came up with some different ways of behaving or playing rather for the certain character I was looking for. So just to open the textbook and learn about extended techniques, I feel that doesn't seem quite right to me.
Mm.
So I was not like after what I can do outside. I feel I'm very happy with the nature of instrument. Each instrument, I think you can do a lot already.
Mm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And there was one question on Facebook by WJ Clymer, and um, that asking about the tuning of the last piece, not the Gayagum piece that you already mentioned about the tuning, but the Gayagum concerto.
Oh, the Song of the Bear.
Some of the Bears, yes, yeah.
가야금 tuning, that was the Sanjo 가야금, traditional 12-string 가야금, and it was a traditional tuning actually. For most of my Sanjo 가야금 solo pieces, I've been using that very basic traditional tuning.
What about the bowed string instruments? Did they have a special tuning as well? Because sometimes they sounded a little different. Is it just a gliss effect?
Yeah, that
Probably.
the part we haven't heard towards the end, they kind of detune the instrument, but we
Hmm.
didn't hear that. So it was just
Okay.
CGDA.
Okay. Yeah. So lots of things just happened, but sounded modern to me at least. And I enjoyed. I could relate myself to some of the characteristics I found in your music, like again the time signature, not using time signature sometimes, and the grace notes, for example. And I sometimes I use them a lot in my music as well. And then when I use them in my music, I become mostly conscious of the flavor of Korean traditional music or Korean speech pattern, like a turn, accent on downbeat per se. Uh, is it similar to you, or did all these grace notes or some other like a Korean tuning come just naturally in your case?
Well, for me, like the example with rain study, for instance, I did that to have the uh, flow of the music different, more unpredictable and complicated also. So I mean, I usually when I use ornaments, they usually I ask them to play before the beat. So
Ah,
mixing short grace notes with fast moving like 16th note. So there is a slight difference, and it's like you
ah,
don't know what's happening, but it's just very interesting suddenly. For instance,
mm,
so grace notes
wow.
are interesting.
Mm. Um, Also, I should ask this as well. So several pieces of yours were performed like without looking at the score by memory, and that's a great compliment to a composer that the music is memorizable in a way. Do you have any, I don't know, advice, or what's your secret?
Well, two different things I can say. First of all, like when my piece, The Wind Has No Destination for 가야금 solo or variations for piano solo, it was extremely difficult. And I had really good musicians who worked really hard, who played using the music. But then about 20 years later, the next generation, they heard it a lot. So it's much easier. Also, they can go to the musicians who played and learn how to do it. So you can do it from memory. And another way is that there are actually many musicians who played the premiere performances of my solo works, very difficult pieces from memory. And they're all these young people. And I don't know what's wrong with them. I try to ask them not to do it because I worry, but somehow people just do it these days.
Wow.
Both Korean
Okay. That's
instrumentalists, both
uh-huh.
non-Korean instrumentalists, they do that. Seems
I
like
see. Hmm.
it's not me.
And just okay, it's them. Okay. They're just a brilliant generation. Um, or you're just being modest. You just mentioned that you worked, you reminded of us of your experiences with Korean instrumentalists and well, just Western instrumentalists. So as a composer who have lots of experiences working with Korean instruments, what's the best you can get out of the non-Western instruments, you think?
I don't understand your question.
So what do you enjoy the most about working with non-Western instrumentalists?
Oh, I mean, I don't divide Korean or Western or Chinese, Japanese. I mean, it depends on how you write the music, and it's all interesting depending on who you are working with. So
Mm,
I think it's case by case, it's different.
that's a very wise word. And speaking of your experience, you work closely with Wooden Fish Ensemble. And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Now, with some friends, and I, for about 20 years now, we have been presenting uh, mostly chamber music and some solo pieces. We began to do that because we are good friends, first of all. It's a very good reason. And also, we are interested, we do two types of music. We present traditional music of Asia and also newly written music for Western and Eastern instruments. And there are not many groups who have musicians or enough energy to bring guqing player, Chinese guqing, Korean kayagum hagum. So we just doing it ourselves. So
Mm,
we've played a lot of music and we did quite a few premieres of new pieces. And we play a lot of my music too.
mm. That's great. You have a big advocate of your music. I have one more question left, but before I ask that question, I would love to invite once again.
Question too. So maybe later.
Yes. Oh no, go ahead, please, Yunji. Dr. Yunji Lee has some question.
Thank you so much for your talk. And actually, I really, really loved your piece. Many of them, but Akhmatova's muse in the piece, the timbre juxtaposition between the woodwind and gayagum, that was so striking. Just strikingly beautiful, and yeah, I really enjoyed your pieces. So thank you so much for your music today. Also, while you were presenting your pieces, I saw on the list also, as I've been as I'm learning your music, you also worked with instruments from other cultures as well within East Asian countries. So I'm wondering what's your compositional process and compositional approach when you write music for those instruments, and is it important for you to incorporate the cultural aspect of or the history of those instruments when do you consider that aspect of the cultural perspectives or social perspectives, incorporating those musical elements into your music? Yes.
First of all, thank you for joining us and for listening and very kind words. I came to the US wanting to study further the non-Korean music, but I ended up becoming more and more curious about traditional music of Korea. So I ended up studying, in addition to the Western music further, I ended up studying Korean traditional music by getting to know the music and learning to play quite a few instruments and pansori, which is a one-person opera. And when I wrote variations, for instance, the first piece we heard earlier today, people really liked it. It seems like that was 31 years ago, and by studying a lot of Korean music and instruments, I think it was natural that I was influenced by the Korean music, and I was very happy that people said very nice things. But as years had gone by, I began to feel gradually that I was like trapped by the Korean music and also Korean this and Korean that. So, without denying the fact that I had studied Korean music and European classical music and some of the newly written American music, I wanted to go further from that point where I felt like a prisoner of my own this world. So I began to take lessons on Chinese guqing, Japanese koto, and shamisen. And at that time, by that point, my interest was not in the any musical style of any particular nation or place, but my interest was in new sounds of new instruments and also the new way of behaviors in my own personal music. So when I write for different mixture of instruments, no, nothing from outside that the history, I mean, that's interesting, but when I write a piece of music or a section of a music or each note, I think of the character that I am trying to achieve. So for me, writing for string quartet, and I've written a few pieces for Korean gayagum and Japanese koto, same thing to me. I'm just dealing with one character at a time.
Could I ask you actually one more question?
Yeah.
Sorry, Teksu. So I came to the States in 2004, and also I'm a composer too, and I've worked with American composers, and I've seen many American composers who freely mix all different kinds of Asian music in a very, very free way. And I was very struck by their freedom in combining, all these cultures without any boundaries. But do you think there is a certain difference between you're using this music from different Asian cultures and American composers freely using this the cultural materials from East Asian countries? So,
Are you telling me that there are some people who are doing it without much knowledge about it, or?
sure, sometimes.
Well,
I mean, just no. I mean, not without knowledge, but I mean, they did study and that they know about the music. But I think for Koreans, for many Korean composers, still our opportunities are more bound to writing music for Korean music or for Korean instruments. But just mentally, still we are not. I think for myself, I can't freely break my boundaries, to write musics for the combination of the instruments from all different countries, and sometimes the ethics of the adapting the music from different cultures, sometimes I have to think about it. So
well, when I began to, for instance, study some Japanese instruments and Japanese music, I don't know a lot about it, but I once wrote, I forget what where I wrote it, but I wrote that when I studied Japanese traditional instrument, when I learned Japanese instrument and some music, I was not like an orphan that I had to be adopted by them, or I wanted to adopt whatever music they are doing, but I had my home as a person who had studied a lot of other things. So I feel comfortable with what I'm doing, but I haven't written for all kinds of instruments, but the instruments I know, and people commission me because they heard something I wrote certain instruments. And for instance, to write the first 가야금 piece in late 1980s, no, late. One of the first pieces I wrote for 가야금 ever was 1999, and I began to take 가야금 lessons in June 1988, and I spent since 1983 or so. I did a lot of research and listening, so I don't feel like I went shopping and then picked up something. But about other composers, I don't really know. You will have to ask them.
yes, thank you so much for your answer.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this conversation. It's, you are just watching the live interaction between the generations of composers using who share some interest. I think it's a beautiful thing, and thank you for the question and thank you for the answer to both of you. And again, Dr. Hyo-shin Na, it's really great to have you here and listen to a lot of your music. All of them are just fascinating, and I cannot wait to check them out more. And unfortunately, it's already 7:30 or 8:30 in the Eastern time. So if anyone has more questions, please stay in the Zoom or ask us on Facebook for further questions, and we could continue our conversation with Dr. Hyo-shin Na. And before we dismiss, I would love to invite you again to our next symposium with Dr. Kay Ree, who teaches at UCLA. And also, you will get some email from us to conduct some survey about how you feel about this symposium series. But until we see next time, please stay safe. It's getting better. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay musical. And I will see you next week.